evening, everyone. Is this on? Yeah. My name's Tasneem. I'm from SWAP, Society Work and Politics Institute, and I just want to welcome everyone here tonight. We are very excited to launch Dineo's book today. It's been a long time coming, and as Dineo got closer and closer to finishing it, the excitement kind of built up. So we're really happy to host everyone today here and to have you join in this discussion and debate over these really important topics. And a book that, in my opinion, is not just academically, but is also politically important. I want to take a moment to just acknowledge that SWAP has been and still is in mourning, and we acknowledge the presence of Prashani in another form here tonight with us. We want to thank all of you for joining us in this discussion, particularly Dineo's family, who I just want to acknowledge, who are here tonight with us. It's one of those rare occasions where academic and personal life can come together. So we're really happy to have you guys here with us. And then lastly, I want to introduce Niren and Dineo, and Niren will facilitate the conversation today, and he'll introduce everyone else on the panel. Niren is a research associate at SWAP and a renowned journalist. Many of you may know him from his journalistic work. More exciting news, in addition to the book we're launching today, is that this afternoon, Niren finished the manuscript for the first of his 2 books to emerge from the project Marikana Senzenina. So we'll see you all here later in the year or early next year for another book launch. And we will be launching Niren's Writing Around the Wicket, a book about cricket, in a month or so. So we'll see you all here for those. So that's Niren. And then, of course, Dineo Skosana, who's a senior researcher at SWAP, the leader of our Just Energy Transition Program. Dineo's research interests are quite broad, many of which are reflected in the book, No Last Place to Rest. They cover mineral and land governance, rural struggles, the politics over land and sacred sites, and the continued salience over traditional leadership in post-apartheid South Africa, which she has published on all of these topics. Those are the 2 people I'm introducing tonight. Niren will take over from here. Please do buy a copy from Wits University Press at the back, and Dineo will be signing copies of the book after this. And because I won't be coming back, just to let everyone know that we'll have some food, some drink, some wine outside at the end of this. So we hope you enjoy this discussion with us tonight, and yeah, chat later.
Thanks, Taz. Thank you, Taz. Before I start, just a little public service announcement. Ms. Mbonwa is from a community that faces various threats of violence and death. So if anybody, especially from the media, is looking to take photographs of the panel, please ensure that she's not in any of the photographs, because it may heighten any dangers towards her. Now that that's out the way, I just also want to say congratulations, Dineo, and anybody and everybody who knows Dineo. Yes. Dineo is one of the most self-effacing people I know, and always shies away from the limelight. And I'm glad you're all here today, because this is a magnificent achievement. It's an amazing book which causes us to kind of rethink land, away from the material into the spaces of the spiritual, even the pre-colonial, to reimagine the yet to come. And I think that's an important thing in this very moment, when there are all these catastrophes and conflicts that we are surrounded by, environmental, political, etc. To start with, I think Dineo is going to be reading an excerpt from her book, which is a fabulous way to start.
Great. Just to say good evening again and welcome, and thank you so much, Tess, for the warm introduction, and you as well, Niren. And just before I read a few excerpts from the book, I just wanted to share a little bit with you about how this book actually emerges. And so is it soft? Maybe I should shout a little bit. Is it better?
Closer.
Does it sound better? Okay. But maybe a bit more boring. So the book emerges out of my PhD study that looks at coal mining and grave locations in the Mpumalanga province. And I wanted to understand why there are contestations around grave sites, and particularly in the area. And so when I joined SWAP in 2019, so that my PhD I started in 2013, and I joined SWAP in 2019, I had an opportunity to actually extend some of these questions that I was grappling with, and to think about some of the gaps that basically emerged out of the PhD. And so for when I joined SWAP, I started looking at the question around what is it that communities lose because of coal mining. And I was already working in the Mpumalanga area, where the communities who live there would have worked on private farm land as labor tenants, and they started burying on the land. And so when the mining company comes in, they negotiate with the private owner. And as a result, their homes are impacted, they are removed from their land, as well as the grave relocations as well take place. And so when I joined SWAP, I had an opportunity to then also compare and think about the mechanisms of dispossession, and to think across different spaces. And I started also looking at the same question on tribal land, where the negotiations to relocate families, for example, would take place with the facilitation of traditional leaders, as they're quite central on customary land. And so it was quite interesting to think about the different spaces, and to think about how loss actually looks like across these spaces, and where communities, for example, would have occupied their homesteads for years, and obviously they would have buried in the space. And so when Tendele comes in 2007, and they want to mine the land through open cast methods, that has impacted their homes, their land again, as well as their ancestral graves. So I wanted to share with you some excerpts from the book, in which I reflect on the people's experiences around the removals, as well as the removals of the exhumation, as well as the reburial of their ancestral graves. So I'll try and read these, and I'm going to try and be quick, Niren, so that I don't get a lash from you. And Ubabutanga, whom I spoke to in the Mpumalanga province, this is what he had to say. Glencore organized trucks and trailers to transport our belongings. The mine covered the cost, but they did not give us an exact date. So when we saw our neighbors pack their belongings in the trucks, we packed too, because we knew the mine was coming for us. You would only know when the truck was at the gate that you're relocating. On the day of the relocations, we were loaded into trucks and left our vegetable gardens and other things. The mine said they'll compensate me, us, that they'll pay for my cattle. Ziphi namhlanje izinkomo zami, ziphi izimvu zami, anginalutho. Meaning, where's my cattle today? And my sheep, I have nothing. And so this is a labor tenant family. He's a representative of a labor tenant family that lived on private farmland in the Mpumalanga province. And in Somkhele, where I spent many years, since 2019 actually, we drank Coke, as Mr. Mbuyezo recounted how his family moved to Somkhele after they forcefully removed from Dugu in St. Lucia in 1959. They lived on a farm with his labor tenant father, who was born in 1913. He later moved to Johannesburg to work in the gold mines, but subsequently came back because of the past laws. We loved that place. It hurts me because my father used to tell me how they were forcefully relocated from St. Lucia. Leo mpilo yokuhlupheka yaqala kulabo. meaning the struggle life began with that generation. Ubaba uthi ngo-1959, umlungu washisa zonke izindlu zasekhaya. Zazilu-4. My father said the white men burned all our homes in 1959. We had 4 houses. We have claimed the land in Dugudugu. We are still waiting, he disclosed. Subsequent to the apartheid's torching evictions, they lived in Dugudugu from when he was 4 years old until they faced the mining-induced relocations in 2008. And so the argument that I actually make in this book is that dispossession is a continuous experience for African people. So these families would have experienced dispossession because of colonialism, but also during apartheid. But I'm arguing that because of mining, they're continuing to experience dispossession. So dispossession is not, an archaic experience, and that's what I'm showing in this book. And then I started speaking to the families about the grave relocations. And this is what in Mpumalanga one of the families shared. My brother was given a date. So when they relocated the graves, it was the 3 of us. We were all present. What they said was, here are your remains. I had never seen remains before, dug up bones. It was my first time. It's unusual. They brought a white sheet and placed them. Simon spoke and said, Mom, uncle, and cousin, we're here to fetch you, to take you to Paula. I sat there wearing a safety hat. So we were transported from Tweefontein to Paula. From Paula, we found their pastor already there. He had been waiting for us. So when we got there, we prayed. Then they asked whether we needed help reburying the remains. I was holding our traditional mats. I brought one. I put the mat on the dark pit and they placed the remains. We did it ourselves and closed with prayers. Then the white men gave us 4,500, and that was it. And Umam Evelyn Nyati had this to say when I spoke to her. I found clothes on my remains. Sibongile, my daughter, was wearing a little dress and a little jersey with flowers. God did well because there were contestations over that grave. Anna had been saying it's their grave, their sibling's grave. So when we got there, we found Sibongile's clothes, which she wore when she drowned. And I'm going through the last one. Mr. Mweli in KZN said, Mr. Mweli, whose family had 7 graves, also mentioned that the remains, including his father's, were placed in boxes which look like those used to package tomatoes. When you hold it, it breaks, he explained. The remains had turned into soil, indicating that these were old. When I asked where these were reburied, he said, at the new graveside. They wrote on the box with a marker, but I would not even be able to show you where these are. So I thought it would be helpful for you to see the images and so that you can actually connect with the experiences of the families that I write about. And so, as I said to you, I've been going to Somkhele since 2019, although of course I've been working in the Mpumalanga area since 2013. And what you see here, it's quite difficult to see, the violence in this specific cemetery. And this is because we had gone just after it had rained. And Usisama is here from Somkhele. And would often spend a lot of time in cemeteries. And so the cemetery basically becomes a site of study, right? But please observe the difference here. There is a huge difference between that image and this one. And this is because we went just after winter, so I'd say August. And so you see here basically the violence that has been caused by Tendele. So what has happened is that Tendele didn't follow the legislative framework, which is the Heritage Act, that articulates how you ought to treat ancestral remains when you relocate these. They hired local unemployed men and North Coast Funeral Parlor to facilitate the process. And because they're inexperienced and also they're not familiar with the law, the graves were not marked. They did not use a proper marking system. And so the families kept saying that there's over 300 graves that are not marked. And at first, in 2019, I couldn't believe that. I thought, oh no, this is something that we'll have to ascertain. But I was fortunate to go with Amanda Esterhazen, who was my PhD supervisor and former head of Origin Center. And we used the marking system, and we were able to actually start counting these. And it is actually true that there's over 300 unmarked graves, and this is cemetery 1. There's 3 more cemeteries, and so these look uniform. And so the families know, for example, that our loved ones lie on the cemetery, but they don't know which specific grave their loved one lies on. And here is an aerial overview of the cemetery, which I was able to do with Amanda Esterhazen. And she started counting because she was really fascinated. I had been working on this area alone with the community, with Zama, who's here, and I'd like to acknowledge. And so when Amanda came in, and she's an archaeologist, and I thought it would be interesting to see the gravesite with an eye of an archaeologist, because I had been seeing it with an eye of a political scientist, partially a historian, and so on. And so this is what it looks like, where the gravesite basically it just has these unmarked graves, and the families obviously don't know where their loved ones lie. And this is the second cemetery. Again, if you look here, you wouldn't even be able to tell that this is a cemetery. On an ordinary day, if you went to some kele, you'll find cattle drinking at times if it had been raining in the space. But an area overview actually of this is how it looks like. And so when you count, you can actually tell that there are over 300 unmarked ancestral graves in Somkele. And my last point, really, so this is the third cemetery, where people's ancestral graves have been relocated from the homesteads and placed next to a mine dump. And what's interesting is that they've used the rock from the mine dump to actually try and demarcate the graves. And they had used, an improper marking system. And as a result, that's why the graves are lost. But I'm also making an argument in this book, and we'll carry on with this conversation. And the argument is that African people experience the violence when they're alive and even when they're dead. And you can see this by how you relocate people from the homestead and then rebury them in a place that actually overlooks a mine dump, right? So the mine dump becomes a constant site or a reminder of the dispossession and what the families would have experienced. So I thought that in this discussion that it would perhaps be useful to have Mbonwa from Somkele to share her experiences a little bit and speak to you. She's not an activist, so she's not quite familiar, speaking with a wide audience or public. But I'll hold her hand and I'll guide her through the process. And Dr. Mbongiseni is here as well, and uzoyenza njalo ma. So bengathanda ukuthi umama achaze ukuthi bansusa kanjani imayini yanthembisani, nokuthi uma kususa amathuna wenu nabonani nazizwa kanjani. So uma ningachaza ukuthi kwakwenzakalani. And I thought it's important to bring her voice because all of this is happening out of sight, out of media, where Tendele is violating people's human rights, and nobody really knows about this. And so I did think it would be useful to have her and share her experiences. Mama ngaqala khulu, so right?
I would like to thank God for carrying me to this place. And secondly, I'd like to thank the young woman in front of me, who arrived at my home. I don't know where she came from. She came to ask me questions, and she came to ask about the mine and what the mine had done to us. we saw people arrive at our home. My mother and I, my mother was still alive then, and we didn't know what they wanted. And they said they'd been sent by the mine to come and drill. There's something that they see in the ground here. So on the first day, they drilled in the fields where we planted. My mother asked them, "What are we going to eat if you come and drill here?" They said, "We don't know. We've been sent by the mine. We're coming here to work." Then the next day they went to the grave sites where the graves were. And they did the same thing. They drilled and drilled and they drilled and they extracted soil of different colors. And then they left. After a while, although I don't remember the amount of time that passed, they came back to tell us now that we are going to be moved. They had a piece of paper on which it was written, this is how much they are going to be paid per house. Each one of your houses is going to be, you're going to be paid this much for your house, this much for your house. And they were not negotiating with us, they were telling us that we are going to be moved. So there were two men, a white man and a black man. And even the black man said, my sister, but this is very little money. How is it possible that you are going to accept this? You should complain. And she said, well, I'm not going to complain because they were not negotiating. They were just telling me what is going to happen. And it also seems like it was being done like this to a woman, because at other homes where there were men, they would approach people respectfully and talk to them in a respectful manner, unlike in this case where they talked to me however they wanted. It was when I asked other neighbors where there were men of stature in the homes, how these people had behaved. They said they behaved much better and they treated them better. It was clear to me that it was because I was a woman that I was being treated like this. It was painful to be moved, and when we moved to a new area, you didn't even know who to talk to. You arrive in a place, you even have chickens, and your chickens go into other people's yards, and you don't know what to do. It was very painful because we're not asked, we're not negotiated with, we're just told, move, we are moving. When it comes to grave relocations, the first thing that happened was I got a message on my phone that money had been deposited into my account. And then they phoned to say they are coming to move our graves. When I asked what this money was for, they said it was for relocating your graves, and that the graves are being relocated. We're not going to negotiate anything with you. There's already a contract that's with the mine that is already in place, so we are going to move the graves. So they paid 4,000 rand per grave. And because it was 3 family members, my brother, my sister, and another sister, they said they were going to combine all 3 of those graves because they were all from the same mother. Before the relocation happened, I got a call from here in Johannesburg that my sister's daughter had died in a car crash. So while we were in mourning and waiting for the body to come from Johannesburg, 4 men came and said, you can't bury this body here. You need to bury her in another place called Norwood. And I said I couldn't do that. And they didn't want me to be next to my mother because they didn't want her to hear what they were talking about. It was 4 men that had come. And I said I couldn't stop the burial of the body. We were going to go ahead. So when the body arrived, she was buried at the same place as the other family members, because even though we had already signed, they had not yet moved the other graves. So they arrived to start digging the bodies. And I said to them, you can't just dig, there's a family that needs to be informed in Nongoma. So they said, fetch them, but I said, I don't have money. So eventually they sent transport to go and fetch my father's. And they were talking about only the 3 that they had paid the 4,000 rand each for, and not the youngest woman who had just been buried. By the time they went to fetch the fathers, the machinery had already arrived to start digging. I had also said to them, I missed this earlier, that there are certain rituals that have to be performed by us as Black people, and I can't just allow you to dig people without those rituals being performed.
Hi. Wow, guys, thank you for such a powerful and harrowing introduction to the experiences at Somkhele. And, listening to the both of you, Mbonwa, your experiences, Dineo just going through some of the excerpts, the argument that the Black experience of contemporary South Africa has not changed from the violence and dispossession that has come before is so clear. And, and I'm just, I can hear the rumble of the trucks remind me of the forced removals, the exposure of the remains of people and the desecration of the remains of people reminds me of the unmarked graves that we've unearthed with activists who've died, like Pila and Ndwandwe, etc., over the course of kind of like attempting to heal ourselves. And I want to start maybe by just asking Mama Mbonwa very quickly, this experience around the graves, how has that changed your family's connection to the ancestors? Do you feel it in any way?
This experience has made us feel very impoverished, and poverty is certain in our family. Nobody, not even a single person in the family, works. My sister's daughter went to a seer, and the person said, "Your mother is not there anymore. You can't even find her anywhere." And that also means I don't dream my mother anymore.
Wow! Again, this is really powerful, and it brings me to something that I was thinking about your work, Dineo. You place the emphasis on working with communities, and that is very clear in the book, in your relationship with Mama Mbonwa. And I just want to talk, maybe just ask you, what is the difference between the kind of research that was done before and the research that you're doing? Because I see a similarity between journalism and research, in the sense that despite our progressive attempts, there's still an element of extractivism that we do when we go into communities, we interview them, we take, and how do we offset the extractivism that we do? What has marked out your practice of working with the community?
Thank you for that question, Niren. I think it's a very important question, particularly because we're in an academic space where, for example, I'd say that the principles of the university as a space actually fosters that kind of work, which is very extractivist. And also, I mean, it overemphasizes publishing. And so when you go into these spaces, obviously, I think you're often naive and you're not sure what is it that you're going to find. But I do think, this is part of the conversations we've had at SWAP, about what it actually means to study, the struggles of communities, right? And for me, the shift was when you start unearthing, or unearthing your findings, basically. That changes the dynamics, in that as a researcher, you feel some kind of responsibility. And I reflect on that a lot on the book. And I do remember at some point, for example, thinking through how in South Africa and in a nation with a history of dispossession, you have a legislative framework, the National Heritage Act, that's written in English, right? And how are you protecting people's cultural rights if you're just writing about, what you're protecting in English? And I think one of the things that for me became quite central is that as part of the research, when you find what you find, you then have to think about your engagement with communities and how you shift that. And part of shifting that is that at times you have to educate communities about the legislation in ways that they understand and in language that they understand. That becomes quite central. And so the researcher really carries quite a lot of responsibility, where your responsibility shifts from really being about accumulating knowledge and publishing, but rather thinking together about how you can actually address questions around social change and social justice, but working with communities in a way that they dictate your agenda, your pace of work, the language as well, even your analysis at times. So it's quite a big responsibility to bear as a researcher. But it's just in closing, I think it's quite an important question, because with what we have is a failed state in South Africa. And so when you come into the communities, you actually bear again a lot of responsibility because of the failure of the state. And so, you get a question about what is it that you will do with this information, right? So it's quite an important question. In fact, when I got into the community, particularly in Mpumalanga, a lot were disappointed that I wasn't a lawyer. They were also disappointed that I'm not a journalist. And they were trying to understand, how does research really help this? But there are a few people who said, actually, no one has actually cared to come and ask us about what our experiences have been, particularly on, for example, the question around graves. There's other environmental justice organizations that have worked on questions around the environment and so on, but not necessarily that aspect. And so maybe there's some light, so then that's how eventually I gained acceptance. But there was some reluctance at the beginning with the fact that I was a mere reluctant political scientist.
Yeah, no, I was quite struck in the Samkele chapter where the community members say that this is the first time that they were asked about their graves by anybody, and that was a significant thing. Firstly, no journalist had done that before, no other researcher had done that before, and I have my own opinions about South African journalism. We won't go there, but what really stuck with me from that little excerpt was one of the old men telling you that you are carrying on the histories of our ancestors, and I think that is a very important thing to kind of think about when we reconsidering the knowledge that we have, and maybe reconsidering pre-colonial knowledge and ways to kind of, again, respond to the crises of our times. But I'm yakking on, and I've been remiss because I have not introduced these two gentlemen to you until now. Mbongiseni Buthelezi has the unenviable task of curating Nelson Mandela's legacy. He's the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. He was also a director at Parry, and he's also co-edited a book with Dineo, Traditional Leaders in a Democracy, Resources. I need to put resources, respect, and resistance. I keep forgetting I'm an old man. And Tembeka Ngcukaitobi is a silk. Oh, there we go. You have a fan club over there. You would know him from television, from the courts. He was awarded Silk in 2020, a clerk of Arthur, former Chief Justice, the late Arthur Chaskelson, and certainly one of my favorite cross-examinations by Tembeka was of Cyril Ramaphosa at the Marikana Commission. So these are these two gentlemen, and to open it up to you guys, what just from your kind of backgrounds, your experiences from litigating, writing, etc. in these spaces, what resonated with you most in the book in terms of yeah.
Thank you very much. Is it on? All right, thank you. If I'm audible. Niren, I think perhaps two things to be said right now. The one is to congratulate Dineo for being a witness to history. We forget this job is also about witnessing history and curating and collecting it for generations. When I read the book, so Dineo got in touch with me through LinkedIn. Imagine that. And she was very apologetic about, invading personal space. I'm like, honestly, so I tried to sort of like, no, okay, it's all right. This is not too personal. But the one thing that struck me was the work of Sol Plaatje, the work of Sol Plaatje, yes. Now, for those who don't know, Sol Plaatje and Richard Msimang, were asked by the South African Native National Congress in 1915 to record the experiences of dispossession of African people. Msimang published a paper, but Seme then, Plaatje then went on to publish the book Native Life in South Africa. Now, many people know the opening lines, that one day a native woke up not just as a pariah in the land of his own birth, blah, blah, blah. But the rest of the book is actually a recordal of family by family experiences of what the Native Land Act meant for them, right? And this book actually struck me because it reminded me of native life in South Africa. Now, this is more than 115 years ago, and there is this connection between native life in South Africa and no last place to rest. This continuity of dispossession you guys were talking about. So in that sense, it was a very powerful piece because it was a witness to history of the contemporary times, which I thought it's actually remarkable. So I thought, okay, well, I phoned later and said, okay, I'm coming to this launch. So this is a book worth attending its launch. The second thing to say is this, the book is striking in its portrayal of the limits of the law without naming it. Yeah. Without naming it, right? Because often we think that law is this thing that will be a shield, against dispossession. And by the way, the lawyers I wrote about also thought the same. Simon thought, the law could be a shield. Seme thought the same thing. And that's why they all ended up doing land cases. They thought they could use the law. Because the law pretends, right, to be about rights, about human rights. That is the pretense of the law. But the experiences of the individual with the law expose the pretense to be a facade. And the book doesn't name that, but it's a theme that runs through. And so it questions, for me, why was the law unable to save the children of Somkel? Why was it unable to save the graves of Somkel? Why was it unable to save the houses of Somkel? Why did it contribute to the dispossession? And especially because this law is now undergirded by an overarching constitution that makes many ambitious promises. So that struck me that here we have an example of the limits of the law. And the law means many things, right? There is government policy writ large, statute, they write. Now here what you have is, if you have a piece of paper issued under the MPRDA, the Mineral Petroleum Development Act, you can actually take people's houses and destroy them. That is also the law, right? So the law is also an instrument of dispossession, and it's an intentional instrument of dispossession. Right? And so we as activists, how do we then use this law as an instrument of empowerment? But in some cases we failed. And so it's good because it does tell us that there will be times when we will fail. Largely because we think that the law can be disconnected from community struggles. But if maybe we had embedded the law in community struggles, maybe we would not have failed. I was in the case. For NGOs on the side of the communities. We lost the case.
that quickly. I mean, were there any? I remember you describing it as a mess earlier on. Just, I mean, any strategies that you would have picked up from
Yes.
any learnings?
Yes, no, they were clear. I mean, this became clear to me when I was arguing in the Supreme Court of Appeal on the final appeal, because the Constitutional Court did not even hear the case. It dismissed it on paper. But on the final appeal, I mean, at 1 o'clock when I was being interrogated by the judges, it became clear to me that the focus on the interests of the NGOs on environment, which was disconnected from the interests of the community, could potentially have been a weakness in the legal strategy. And since then, actually, the cases I have run on this sort of thing, Shell, the Western Cape case, the Eastern Cape titanium case, Olobe, even if I have environmental arguments, I've tended to ground them in popular community struggles, such as we are fighting for the right of the community to say no to mining. You know? So I think that was the big strategic error that we made in that case.
Do you want to go, Mbongiseni?
Thank you. So I think in addition to the limits of the law, I think we also need to think about the limits of the state. Limits in two ways. One is, so laws have been written under the Constitution, the MPRDA, say the Environmental Protection Act, the Heritage Act. So one of the things I think that comes into view for me reading this book is how those pieces of legislation that are meant to protect people, to protect people's rights in those communities, also then fall into this very complex state where different parts of the state are responsible for different laws, essentially. And where they come together, it is really where the rubber hits the road, where communities in struggle are faced with a mind that is trying to expropriate their land. And the different parts of the state that should be coming to people's rescue and people's defense. One, you see bureaucracies that simply do the bare minimum, where the bureaucrats will not intervene, where it's their job to intervene. But also, what we also see is that there are gaps where, because of this fragmentation of different parts of what's supposed to be a protective shield for communities falling into different departments. And so there are certain things that happen that are done by these mining companies when no department will intervene, right? It is just left to the mining companies to do what they want to do. It is left to Amakosi to do what they want to do. The other part of the limits of the state for me is precisely what Dineo, emphasizes here, the role of traditional authorities and the way that mess has not been resolved in democratic South Africa. So what happens is you see, again, people who are supposed to be intervening, simply deferring, simply bowing down to chiefs and letting them do what they want. Chiefs whose power in those communities in some ways has been, because of their inability in South Africa to fully define what the role of chiefs is, they've simply by stealth taken the power and are using it in many places against communities. This is what is, in this case, in the case of Somkele, this is what shows up really strongly in how Dineo has written about it.
Yeah. Both your responses kind of bring together two things that are particular pet hates of mine. One is that I feel sometimes that judges, when they attempt to interpret what they see as traditional custom, law, culture, etc., they rely on a codification which I think Chief Justice Sandile Ngcobo warned against in a Walpole lecture several years ago, former Chief Justice, about relying on a codification that comes from a colonial mechanism, like Theophilus Shepson, etc., kind of codifying law in a very particular way to the benefit of colonial powers. And it seems like contemporary judges are not expansive enough in their imagination or in their knowledge to go further, and they vest power in hierarchical traditional structures. I mean, am I correct, incorrect in that? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm suggesting that Mbongiseni must go first, but apparently I've not succeeded. No, I mean,
not as convincing a lawyer as you thought
you are right, Niren, because I mean, it depends. It depends on what you mean by custom.
Yeah.
You see, because custom could be a codified set of rules, and those codified set of rules could then be a reflection of the person who codified them. In the South African context, the first attempts at codification were done by the colonial powers, and chief among those was Theophilus Shepson in the 1873 Native Administration Act, which subsequently became a national law in 1927, setting all of the rules, starting with the family structure. The family structure of the Zulu is comprised of a kraal. The head of the kraal is the man, and everyone else belongs to the head of the kraal, And so giving power to the man, and thereafter giving power to the chiefs that have been selected, so-called government indunas, chiefs that have been selected by the government as the head of all heads, chief of all chiefs. But why they were doing it, it was a form of control. The British came here, they realized that there are too many natives, we can't be dealing with all of them. So what we need a system of indirect rule, where we put one chief induna to be responsible for 1,000 others. And so our instructions will go to that induna for dissemination. So that's what indirect rule is about, But in order for the system to work, they all need a set of rules, and we will craft these rules according to our imagination of what a native likes and a native doesn't like, And then that became then custom. But at the heart of it was the concentration of power over women, power over land, and that was given to the men. That became the law literally until 1994. That is why today, whenever you debate custom, the people who defend the colonial version of custom are the chiefs and the men. And they remind you, no, this is our custom. Our custom says we pay 12 cows for lobola, but actually this was a thumbsuck from Shepson. But then there's a complication, Niren, because, what is a custom in fact?
It's a very important question.
Because is custom the thing that existed on the 5th of April 1652 before Jan van Riebeeck arrived? Or is custom something more expansive? My own stab at it has been to think of custom as living custom, to think of custom more as self-determination, to think of custom as what we, the current living, decide about our lives. Not to think of custom in a fossilized, unchanging way that pretends as if colonialism did not happen, but to try and rescue it from the chiefs into communities. So the communities are entitled to say, actually, it's true that our custom in the past was that a woman could not succeed as a chief. But our custom in 2025 is that she can.
Yeah.
That too is custom.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen it with Zwelithini, the late King Zwelithini, calling for circumcisions after King Shaka allegedly, banned it back in the day. But Mbongiseni, just like carrying on from what Tembeka was saying, building on that, there's also the impression that the ANC has just essentially replaced a rural feudalism that existed in the Bantustans, for example, in KwaZulu, with a new feudalism to create voting banks or to attempt to create voting banks in KZN. I mean, can you maybe draw that into your reflections on the role of traditional leaders and how the courts and power interpret customary law, etc.?
I'm going to take that in a slightly different direction, and I want to ask us to think just about the complexity of the players when it comes to, and I want to bring it back to Somkele and Tendele, the complexity of interests that converge when we're thinking about a mining interest in a coal mine being established in Tendele, in Somkele. So let's take the ANC. There are really strong interests, I think, that are deeply inside the ANC and deeply networked into power globally that have a hand in coal mining. One of the things that we also need to remember is in creating the project of creating black industrialists, 100 black industrialists and whatnot, there's a very strong interest in certain of those people who've been funded, say, by the state. They have a very deep interest in coal mining. And some of those people are very, in some of the work that we've done, we've found that they are very, this is partly, I'm going to link it to other elements of South African society. They're donors to the ANC. And so when it comes to, say, trying to ask for transparency in electoral funding, in political party funding, for example, some of the resistance is coming from those interests that are funding into the ANC and then getting interests in the state or through the issuing of mining licenses because of those networks. But if we expand the network of, or the analysis of what are the interests in mining, in the book, Dineo writes a little bit about some of the people in the community that were promised jobs, that were promised contracts by the mine, and those good jobs and contracts simply did not realize. But you do find in Tendele, I know that area quite well. I got an aunt who lives close by there. You do find that there are people who do have contracts in the community, who have contracts in the mine to provide trucks, to provide transport for mine workers. Those are also some of the people who become the gatekeepers. And in the book, Dineo writes about the assassination threats against people who are opposing this mine, from people who are saying, we are workers in that mine, who are being laid off because of your activism. And so in those communities, we find this complexity, and we've seen this in Northwest, in platinum mining, etc., in places where I've worked in the past, where there's such a concentration of different interests that are networked all the way up to power at national level, in political parties, etc., that converge there. And we've got to also disaggregate those interests to understand them in order for us, I think, to sharpen our own activism as well. Chiefs, I think, then fall into that basket in many places. And we know what has happened in many places, that you find chiefs putting themselves at the front as representatives of communities, as the people who give permission for mining to happen on that land, as the people who actually instruct people to move, as we see in the book, and Dineo writes quite extensively about this. So they themselves are also interested parties, and in many places they're actually paid by the mines. We found this is happening as we speak near Melmoth, where a new mine, there's an attempt to establish a new mine, and there's resistance from the community. What we've established there is that the Induna in the area and the chief, in fact, right up to the said Zwelithini, were actually being paid by the mining company. And so instructing people to accept the mine because their interests are now bound up and tied with the mine. And they themselves pull away from the interests of the people that they're supposed to be leading. So there's really a lot of interests. And we can take that further and think about the state and the different parts of the state that are also involved. Those interests, I think, we need to just understand better. It's going to help us, I think, be better at our own activism about this.
Dineo?
You know, just to build on what Mbongiseni has said and
Yeah.
your question, as you were posing it, I mean, I was thinking to myself, how would you have judges not have a limited or archaic or colonial interpretations of custom when traditional leaders themselves, who are meant to be custodians of the land, of culture and heritage, don't have a sense of what that custom ought to look like. Because in Somkhele, and I reflect on this, traditional leaders agreed basically, particularly when there were negotiations around compensation, right? They agreed to say Indlu ngendlu could get 9,000 for a cow because that's how much it costs. Imbuzi, that will be 1,005, right? And they've agreed that this is what you'd give. So I'm saying that the traditional leaders agreed that a cow would be 1,005, a cow would be a 9,000, a goat will be 9.5. And all these are quite important, particularly in the rituals that communities have to practice umagususwa umuntu, or when you relocate a person. Now, traditional leaders have signed and said, this is okay. You can give my people this amount. And what makes it worse, and as Umama would have articulated, is that they then lump, for example, kukhona bantu, there's people who have over 20 graves. Ubabugina, for example, in the book that I write about, he's got about 30 ancestral graves. And the mine would say that they'll relocate all of these with that amount, with 9.5 for a cow and or 9,000 for a cow and 1.5 for a goat, and that's about it, right? And this is partly because the law hasn't quite articulated how much do you compensate this particular experience or practice. And so this is problematic. And so for me, when you asked about custom, and I've had conversations with Mbongiseni before about this to say, what is the role of traditional authority in South Africa if it's not to safeguard those interests? And for me, I've been very sympathetic of traditional leaders because there's an argument that hasn't been made in academic writing that they too were actually victims of dispossession. Dispossession actually crippled the institution of traditional authority. And so I've been sympathetic, and partly because in the formation, for example, of the African National Congress, traditional leaders were actually quite central. Some of the founders came from families of traditional leaders, right? They were children of traditional leaders, some of them. And so that's why you've had, and this has been my argument in the long run, that's why you've had the ANC, to some degree, of course, amongst other reasons, dancing around the question about what do you do with them. But of course, this has become problematic in the current political dispensation because it hasn't been defined. And then it just so happens that the minerals are concentrated in the former homelands in South Africa. And so they're quite central as a local political actors or in the local political economy. And so then for me, having been sympathetic historically around traditional authority, I've shifted with time to gradually start posing this question because it's very key to say, how do you actually have this violation happen under your watchful eye? And then I've also asked myself as a researcher, is then my responsibility to go to Somkhele and say, Baba, and speak, for example, to the tribal council, and say, Baba, that's not how you treat your community. How
has that gone down if you have...
to say abantu bakho, your history, people's identity, people's sense of belonging and heritage, right? People's sense of citizenship, because that's what a grave is. It's about belonging. It's an evidence of existence and heritage. Now, if you allow that to be desecrated, I'm not sure if I'm the rightful person to be actually speaking to traditional authority, educating them about how they should be treating their people, if indeed inkosi ngabantu.
Yeah. Mama Mbonwa, what has your experience been of the traditional leadership in your area? Has it shifted because of your struggle?
We are being oppressed by the Induna, we're being oppressed by the Inkosi. the Induna is the very person who came to tell us we need to move. And when the Inkosi never even convenes our community meetings to ask how do we feel about being told to move. When we ask questions, the Inkosi is the very person who says, go back to where you came from. You came here to ask for a place to settle. And now you don't want to move when we are being told to move. Is the same person who tells you, you have to go back to where you came from.
Guys, we're reaching the end, and I'm going to open it up for questions soon. But I want to ask one question of each of you. It's a reasonably similar question because, Dineo, your book compels us to reimagine land use. And, you make the point, again, I've got to put my glasses on, sorry. You make the point that, the removal of graves and the desecration of graves and the use of land, access to land, dispossession of land, it's not simply about the physical space, but it's also about the spiritual and sacred connections that families have with their ancestors at birth and over time, and this loss is kind of intangible and immeasurable. And this is a question it's a question for all of you, but there's a caveat for Tembeka. What about your experience from the work you've done, from the struggle you've done, or even from reading the book, has any of that caused you to reimagine land in a particular way? Or has it broken something in your relation to land? And for Tembeka, I think I want you to speak to the Meriki judgment, the case that you argued the other day, because I think that's interesting in terms of kind of, the ideas of enclosure, access, etc. But yeah.
Thank you, Niren. I just wanted to read something from the book. This is a book launch, so let's read the book.
I heard I should have done that.
Yes. Page 152, called Lawful Exclusion, under the subheading, A Dehumanizing Market-Driven Rationale. The hegemony of a neoliberal market rationality has created an environment that sees the continuing and reworked legal exclusion of the previously marginalized, compelling them to find alternative ways to assert their belonging. A market-driven rationale pushes neoliberal market principles into the very fabric of democratic states, and neoliberalism becomes a distinct form of political rationality that is enacted through specific techniques of governance practices and legal tweaks. In other words, economic rationality is normatively applied to all forms of human activity. Now, I think this is very powerful because it's towards the end of the book. I know people will buy them, they won't read it. People buy books, they just don't read. Just like me, I think 95% of the books I have, I never opened them. But I'll read yours.
I hope you read mine.
I was forced to read this one because I was coming to a book launch. But the point I'm trying to make coming from that extract is that what the book has also enabled us to rethink is the role of capitalism and an extractivist economy. Niren, when the MPRDA was passed in 2002, it was actually seen as a triumph, right? As a transformative law. And it was opposed by landowners and opposed by the large mining houses, the Anglo-Americans. I was actually interested to see that one of the grave desecrators here was Glencore. So I was like, what hope is there for these communities if they have to contend with the likes of Glencore? But the point here is that when this law was conceived, it was meant to be an instrument to enable the state to transform the mining sector. It was meant to be a good thing for communities. But our experiences in the last 20 years of trial and error with this law is that it actually has not achieved transformation. It has a clause, a very interesting clause, that if a mineral occurs in community land, the community is entitled to apply for that mineral, to have a mining right over it. But those mining rights are never actually approved and processed by the bureaucrats that administer this law. And so what this law has enabled is that it simply has facilitated a sort of a hyper form of extractivism, where we are creating a super capitalist class that's based on extracting and sell, and not even bothering to process the material, where you could say, okay, I'm creating jobs, etc. And in the process of doing so, they have destroyed the environment. And I ran the case, I can't remember when we ran the Xolobeni case. One of the experts we had was a gentleman from the Benchmarks Foundation, who gave a very powerful expert affidavit, which showed that there is not a single community that was better off after 30 years of mining. Not one. Everywhere across, whether it's platinum or gold or coal, any mineral you can think about, every time mining is always bad for communities. And so when the Xolobeni community says, no mining here, it's nonsensical to tell them you're going to lose jobs. Because firstly, the jobs are fewer than promised. The quality of the jobs is bad. The jobs are bad for health. And the mining damages the water. It destroys the environment. So ultimately, the net outcome of mining is always negative for communities. So coming back to your point, which made me to start thinking when I was reading Dineo's book, made me to start thinking whether we should not actually be asking whether any further mineral rights should be issued at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Why should we continue mining? Like, what's the reason? The explanation of the capitalists is that it's for employment, But we know these are short-term jobs, but it's ultimately bad for humanity.
And especially when, communities like Xolobeni, they're coming up with responses or alternatives to mining, which actually respond to the environmental crisis. They're talking about biodiversity, the use of medicinal plants, creating a completely different environment, one which isn't polluted and extractive, but is actually kind of responding to.
Yes, but those, by the way, Niren, that's an excellent point. Those are not written into the structure of the law, because the structure of the law only recognizes the extractivist form of mining that's driven largely by capitalists, people with money. We have to rethink our relationship with the land. The Mereki judgment is an excellent judgment of the Land Claims Court, which entitles occupiers in farms to keep stock, goats, sheep, cattle, even though it recognizes that they have no title over it, because it's questioning the entire conception of property as exclusive and absolute, and beginning to reconsider it as shared, communal, and inclusive. We debated the whole case at the Constitutional Court towards the end of March. Already there were disagreements anchored into what is our vision of constitutional property? What does the Constitution actually require of property relations? Right? What does it really require? On the one hand, is a school of thought that says the Constitution is clear in protecting private property. The other school of thought, which I've been advocating, is that actually the Constitution does not protect private property at all. What it does do is to break down private property and to enable people that were previously excluded to get into the property game. The entitlement to keep cattle is one step, because it's keeping cattle on land that's not registered under your name by law, meaning that property is no longer the exclusive domain of the person whose name is on the title deed. So I'm hoping for a right outcome.
And that's really interesting because it forces us to reimagine land without fences, which goes back to kind of a period before enclosure. It's like, we're going back to, way back. Mbongiseni?
So for me, I'm going to come back to the book again and remind us of something that Dineo just mentions in passing in the book. It's in KwaZulu-Natal in particular, going back to talking about chiefs, it's the existence of this beast called the Ngonyama Trust.
Oh, my late friend Patty Harper wrote a lot about that. Yeah.
And the struggle that still needs to be waged there, because the deals that were struck in the transition to democracy have left us with legacies where they've really placed communities like Somkele at the mercy of the Zulu King and whoever his agents are, which then means, I mean, the question of land and how people relate to their own land. And I'm going to bring it back to the experience of part of my family here as well. It's something that, has become quite difficult to navigate. So my own family became labor tenants, in fact, in the Babanango area, between Babanango and Vryheid, on land that had been historically Buthelezi land, our own land. And because of abuse by farmers that my grandfather in particular suffered, they then moved up north to Nongoma and settled in that area. And that's really where they kind of come to bear the brunt of Zulu power in some ways. The extraction of rent on their own land by the king and the chiefs is something that continues to this day, even though there've again been very progressive judgments in the courts against the Ngonyama Trust. And so it's made it very difficult. I mean, I think for some of us to even imagine living in communal areas. I wouldn't want to live in a communal area. Thankfully, my parents moved to a township and bought their own little piece of land. So I wouldn't want to be living anywhere near a chief, under a chief. It's something that happened at a young age, actually, being sworn at by a chief. And from then on, my struggle against chiefs, I think, began and continues.
I hope you're a buccaneer then. I hope you're a buccaneer then.
No, actually.
That's an interesting conversation. But I just want to take you a little back to a workshop that I conducted with the community in Somkele, and I was working with All Rise, which are attorneys for environmental justice and climate change, something like that. And in this workshop, I was trying to basically speak to the community about the Heritage Act and what their rights are, and thinking through that in vernacular, which was quite interesting. And I remember an old man who stood up when I asked them, you know, what's the meaning of the land? Why are people prepared to die for the land? And he stood up and he said, Umhlaba umbhede wethu. The land is our bed. Silala kuwo. Sonke, wonke umuntu. Manje umhlaba mawuthathwa yimayini. Thina abantu abamnyama silale kuphi. So the land is our bed, we sleep on it, everyone. Now when the mind dispossesses the land, where must we, black people, sleep? And so I thought this is really a powerful quote. Because basically it spoke to the contrasting meanings around land, where the mining companies see the land as storage of minerals, of wealth, and communities see it beyond its materiality, and they see it also as a place that is sacred, through which they can connect, for example, with their ancestors, and they can connect, for example, with their history. And so I thought these competing understandings around land are very interesting. And you also see, and I write about this in the book, where the mining companies both actually are guilty of this. When they go to an area around Somkele, in fact, this was my first encounter with Advocate Ngcukaitobi, but he wouldn't remember. I was an expert contributor in the Somkele case, which he said he failed on. But what was interesting, and I was writing in that expert report, which is that when the mining company comes in a homestead, for example, what they see is a concrete structure, right? Indlu kagogo, which is a sacred altar. Now it's built umama, and some of you would know who live in rural areas, it's built with mud. And then the top part is a thatched roof. Now that looks really cheap, and it looks like a structure that you can replicate. Secondly, they see isibaya, which is a cattle crawl, and they don't quite think about what is it that happens around isibaya. That it is a particular site of initiation. It's also a site that is sacred, where men go in and speak to Abapanti and so on, and as the communities would articulate. And so if you study the homestead, what you find is that how its use is quite important. So if you asked a family, what's the importance of the land? They wouldn't be able to explain it to you. But if you ask them, what do you do around your homestead? That's where you start seeing its importance, including, for example, where amangwabo lies, where they would, bury on the side of the cattle crawl. And they'll also have their own customs around how you bury umuntu omdala, how you bury koko, how you bury your great-grandfather, your grandmother, your mother, a woman, a child, and so on, at the back of the house and so on. All those details are, the birth of a child and how you bury the umbilical cord, through which you mark where the person will be returned. And so what this explains is that actually the land is not just this material thing that you can replace and say, okay, we've dispossessed you, therefore we'll find you another space, right? People have got attachments to this place, and then it informs a question around compensation, which I think is an interesting discussion to have, particularly within courts. How then do you compensate that which was lost? And if you think about that in the book, and with questions around land, the project of land reform in South Africa, how do you return the land? How do you repair? How do you restore that which was lost? And you can see that we also have a state actually that thinks along the same lines, which is that the land is just replaceable, right? We use a market value, and so we'll place you elsewhere. But they don't quite think about what is it that people historically would have lost. And communities have argued in this case that, the graves are actually a form of evidence, a form of their being, and that removing these, it's actually a process of erasure, which is quite important to think about. And so I know we've spoken about a lot, and some of you might be, struggling to say, okay, we've spoken about a lot of things, but the book makes, I'd say, two arguments, and I think that's what I'd like you to take away. One is that if you look at historical writing around dispossession, you think about dispossession in relation to colonialism, apartheid, but you don't think about how that continues to take place in the post-apartheid era. So that's my first submission. The second submission is that the writings around dispossession hadn't considered the spiritual question. And so, there's amazing work that has been done, but it doesn't quite, think through, for example, questions around spiritual dislocation, spiritual insecurity. What does it do when you remove the person, their being, away from the land? And so I think that's another aspect which I think is my contribution, particularly in relation to this book.
Thank you for that. Mama Mbonwa, maybe it may not be something that she has reimagined from her experiences of struggle, but maybe something that has been broken even. I don't know if she wants to comment. Yeah.
Just make sure your question is clear.
So similar question, but not necessarily what is reimagined in the relationship to the land, but maybe something that has been broken because of the experience that she has had because of the land.
Everything has changed because of the mine. We plant crops and they don't grow like they used to on the land that we are on now. Goats are dying. They eat the grass. We see them getting sick and dying. Everything has changed because of mining.
It's really powerful, and I think what this conversation is kind of really, what's haunting me about this conversation is the question of what can never be returned when what is taken away when people suffer dispossession, and what can never be returned when land may be given back. And that's something that I've been thinking about. But to open it up to you guys, can we have crisp reflections and smart answers, questions? Sorry.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Patrick Olo Matqavana. It's good to see my former counsel sitting there. On the previous occasion, we were trying to dismantle the race and gender pay gap. But I stand here today as a Transkeian, not as a South African, as a Transkeian, as a Bantu stan. And my counsel, I'm going to get to you shortly because I disagree with your position insofar as private land ownership. And I'll tell you why from a personal experience. 70,000 homesteads, including Amanxiwa, in what we call the former rural Transkei, are under the colonial proclamation 227 of 1898, passed under King George V. Now, in terms of this proclamation, which is still active, it means these 70,000 family homes in Kala, Dutjwa, Mthatha, Ngamakwe, Ngobo, Etsomo, naseNgamakwe are seeing no development because, first of all, coming to the topic at hand, I've gone into the records and found out actually that whenever the colonial government and through the missionaries were applying for church land, there's a provision in the quitrent that says if ever minerals are discovered on that land, the state would have title to actually extract the minerals that are under that land. Now, practically, we are now in 2025. That's a law of 1898, which, by the way, is still active, very much active. I'm nervous in my voice because this disturbs me and disturbs my ancestors, honestly. Because we are excluded from all constitutional rights. That's why I say I'm a Transkeian, I'm not a South African. We are excluded from the Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, meaning when the municipality is planning for budget and facilities, those towns are absolutely excluded, but are given seconds. We are excluded from the Geomatics Professions Act. We don't have addresses. So if you're from these rural towns and you're looking for an address, you actually won't find one. If you ever needed hospital or police, they can't actually get to you. Now, my former counsel, let me get to the point. So in light of this situation here in Mpumalanga and KZN and it being on tribal land, do you not think that if these families actually had title to that land, it would have made it difficult for the chiefs to be co-opted by private mining interests? That's my first question. Secondly, there was an issue about the valuation of the land. Again, these rural lands are excluded from the Municipal Valuation Act, which happens. In such a case, Umama would have known that this land is valued and it's not, and the value of the land is not 4,000 Rand, but it is whatever is officially valued. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Dineo, congratulations on your book. And I think this event today has been rather moving in terms of the personal narratives that have been shared. So congratulations on that. And I think it's very good work. So my questions will be more anchored from, I suppose, an economics perspective, or perhaps more materialist, if we can call it that. So the first observation I noticed when we were talking about the issue of goats for rituals and cows and prices and so on, and how the mining company sort of wanted to bundle the costs there. One thing I found very interesting is that there's been a narrative in the country about paying market value or market prices for issues, for things. But then in this particular instance, the mines forwent paying a market price and instead paid less than the market price, and then that became an issue. So that's one comment that I found very interesting. The second one is around notions of spirituality. So my personal evolving view is that a lot of Black cosmology and Black spirituality tends to be rooted in sort of like an agrarian mode of production. And as society is sort of moving towards a more industrialist mode of production, there tends to be a bit of conflict between that. So an example would be like in urban settings with this densification and people are living in high rises and do not have access to land. So in your view and having thought about this thing, how do you see sort of like Black spirituality evolving in such a context where people no longer have plots of land, but people are living sort of like shared spaces and so on? The other question, I suppose, maybe on the advocate's side, where he was talking about a case, I think, where we sort of like move from exclusive use of people who own land. So in my mind, I'm sort of seeing that as sort of like traversing back to like pre-enclosures in England and more tragedy of the commons type of issues. I think it's perhaps a little bit of what the gentleman also was alluding to in his question. So do you see us having an issue where sort of like communal land use sort of degenerates and nobody takes responsibility for it because it's everybody's land? And then how do you foresee us circumventing that problem? Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, and congratulations to Dr. Skosana for the book. So my name is Shadrach, and I just want to ask a simple question. I don't know who I can direct it to, maybe to the advocate or rather to the doctor. All right, thank you. So on Friday is Good Friday, right? And some of us are African, so we are going back to our Bantustans. As the brother said, I'm from the north, the former Venda Bantustan. And on Saturday, what's going to happen is that we are going to a white farmer to ask for permission to access the graves of our ancestors, to pay homage to ancestors. And when we try to say we want to claim the land back, we are told that there's no food without farmers. So our dispossession, it has to be eternal because some white farmers have to produce maize for us to eat. So my question is really the chiefs that are the same all over the country. The chiefs are not the custodian of culture in this country, but they are a custodian of Black subservience on behalf of their political masters, the very same political masters that issue mining licenses to these companies. So how can we reimagine a system of governance whereby I have to distinguish between who should account to me between my chief or the ward councillor where I live? So who should be the supreme, or rather who should be the voice of our people? It should be the municipal mayor or it should be the chief, So that's my question. On the issue of spirituality, how then are we supposed to be as Africans in a system which is governed by market principles? Everywhere we go, we are told of the market. The people are never included. So we as Africans were relegated to nothing, but the market comes first. So how are we supposed to live our lives when we have to subject ourselves to the market and we don't even know who that market is? Thank you.
Mine is more of an acknowledgement to Mbonwa. I understand what you are going through because I've been through that. Personally, I've got my parents buried. One of them, I cannot access their grave. The other one, when I go to their grave, I feel better and I feel whole. My question and a challenge is to our academic minds in the room. How much education has been done to the laymen about their rights when it comes or when it pertains to such issues? The challenge that I'm seeing here, and I'm also guilty of this. I'm in health technology, by the way, and I don't think any of you know what that is. I am guilty of that because we have not done much to educate anybody about what health technology is. In this space, though, what I would like to understand is how much from a legal fraternity, Dineo Skosana, have we done, or have you, not me, I'm not a lawyer, but how much have you done, not you personally, but as a fraternity, in terms of educating people about their fundamental basic rights when it comes to issues like this? Because Umama uti, I did not even try to challenge the white man because he came here to tell me he was not negotiating. That means for me, if Umama knew better about her rights, she would have something to say back to the white man who was telling her what he was telling her. I don't know if much has gone to that, but back, and this is not a challenge just for the legal fraternity, but for all the academics. Dr. Dineo, you have done a great job in bringing this to the fore, and there's people in the room, and the room is full. But this conversation should not be only in this room. I think this conversation should be happening in every street that we have in Soweto or Tembisa, for people to know what their rights look like when it comes to things of this nature. That is my contribution and the challenge to you guys as the brains that are leading us, and we are very grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
I'm going to try and respond to some, because I'm worried about the time as well. The question about the title deed in South Africa is very interesting. And to some degree, I was grappling with the question, particularly when the communities were saying, we don't want ancestral graves to be relocated. And I remember one of the activists saying, we're surprised about this practice because so we don't wake a person that has passed on. And so now, in fact, that informed the title of the book, and who said, Githina nje ayisekho le ndaba yokuthi umuntu uye endaweni yakhe yokugcina. So she meant that we don't have this idea that the person is now laid to their last place of rest. And so, and I was, as I was conversing with the communities again, the graves as a form of evidence, particularly in cases of land restitution, right? Where people had to use those to actually, to demonstrate that they had occupied and worked the land over years. And I started thinking that it looks like an ancestral grave, apart from other meanings, is itself a title deed. Right? I thought that's quite interesting to think about it in that way, and that it gives you that sense of ownership to the land that ordinarily you wouldn't have in South Africa. And I think this is something to actually think about, more further, particularly with questions who live on customary land where there aren't title deeds. But this conversation we've debated with Luck, Plath, and others, we work very closely. And at some point I worked under Mbongiseni, in fact, at the beginning of my career, reporting to him. And the question around title deed is very sensitive. And it was interesting that it's also a conversation I'd have with Prashani, because she was working in the orange farm and working around what does it mean to give a title deed. Now, to cut my response short, is that it brings complexities for those communities on customary land, because what it means is that they now have to pay for rates, which they currently do not, all right? Except they were paying the Ingonyama Trust, PTOs, permission to occupy. And of course that has been scraped, but it means you have to pay rates. But of course it comes with a particular sense of ownership, and perhaps the mine would have negotiated with them if they heard this. But then it also dismantles the idea of a community. And do we want that? And that's a conversation we've actually sat with colleagues and debated. And I remember in the land conference, which we organized together with Luck in 2022, and this was really a central and a burning question, and what that would look like, right? So it could work, but it also comes with certain limitations. Now, I won't go through all of this because it's quite a lot, but the market-centered philosophy, you also see it, for example, with the whole expropriation bill and so on, right? What has happened is that we have a state that has realized that its land reform project has failed because they were using this model of a willing buyer, willing seller. And so the state here is actually trying to somehow self-correct. all right, by saying perhaps let's just expropriate and not pay compensation, which to some degree it was allowed. And I followed Advocate Ngcukaitobi's arguments that to some degree that was possible within the Constitution. They didn't necessarily have to want to amend anything. But for me, that philosophy is problematic as well. There's something that it's pointing out. It's not to say, let's expropriate without compensation because there's a moral there's a moral wrong in basically buying back the land that was dispossessed. It's actually saying on the other side that no, we just can't pay enough because the budget that we had is not enough to actually address this problem. So I do think it shows a fundamental problem in our state, its political will and its philosophy. Because you can't have a philosophy that says you will buy back the land, or a model that says you buy back the land from your dispossessors. There's everything morally wrong with that. And that's what we've done. And now the state is realizing we can't upkeep that market model. But of course, it extends to areas that are mined where you see, again, market principles always central, promising jobs, promising development, and so on. And you have a mineral law, which is market-driven, and how it's applied, it's in ways that go back to questions around absolutism, where if you've got a mining right, basically you can dictate the land use and so on, or surface use, which is very problematic. And so that mineral law overrides everything. Basically, it overrides the protection of heritage, of heritage rights and others, including environmental rights of communities. And so there's everything wrong with that approach. And on the education that has been done, I love that push because you're asking about what is it that we're doing as academic minds, writing these books and so on. What is the responsibility? And I think it ties again to the question that Niren posed, that we have to think beyond. And I would have loved Prashani to be here because these are the conversations we would also have at SWAP about what's the responsibility of the researcher, particularly in a country such as South Africa with a failed state, and what's scary, and I'm closing, is that with the energy transition, there are critical minerals that are in demand for the shift, and so these questions around dehumanization, human rights violation, are going to come back again if we are not addressing questions around the role of traditional authority in South Africa. If you don't address the land question, we'll be sitting back again here, and I'll be producing a second book now writing about critical minerals and the dispossession of communities. So it shows that it's actually a matter that we have to address and educate, as you're saying. And you would have seen in my motivation to have you over now when I wrote you a formal letter. And I said that we need to educate legal minds. We need a kind of education that brings us closer to the people. And this is a conversation I would have often with Pushani and my colleagues at SWAP, that it's the kind of education that actually speaks to questions around social justice, not the kind that actually removes us. So we want engineers to understand these questions around the sacredness of the land, and not just the kinds who just want to build a bridge and not engage with who will use it, how, on whose land it's sitting, and so on. So it's a very important question that you've asked, and thank you for that.
Maybe I'll just touch on two things. One is the question my brother asked about going home this weekend and having to go and ask for permission from a farmer to go and access his ancestral graves. So I think it goes back to the point Dineo was making, that Advocate Ngcukaitobi has written about this, the failure of our land reform program, and we need to reimagine anew what equitable access to land is going to look like going forward. There's a debate and I think a fight that we need to have. And we have launched at the Nelson Mandela Foundation last December on the anniversary of Madiba's passing, in fact, a case against the state, gone back to law again, to try and compel the parliament and the executive to put a vision forward for the country on how we're going to achieve equitable access to land. And I think around that, what we're then going to see and what we want to build is a platform for debating these things out. While we're having the fight in court, we're also thinking about what is the mechanism that we need to build? What is the state going to look like that it can actually move us towards equitable access to land and not fail like it has so far? And so I think that question of a public debate and of us duking it out in a way that perhaps we don't kill each other, but we really still need to have this fight. So I think that's going to become a public debate and a public fight around this particular case in which a certain advocate, Ngcukaitobi, is actually going to be arguing the case. And then I think just briefly on the question of spirituality in a changing environment where market rationality is kind of the primary way in which we think about things. So I think the book makes it clear that the objection to the mine paying 9,000 rand for a cow and 1,500 rand for a goat is not the material, or rather it's not the price that is attached. It's the fact that in practicing the rituals that need to be practiced, what you need to do is for each and every one of those people who are being exhumed and reburied, you have to actually have a cow and a goat and practice. I mean, you have to perform those rituals for each and every one. And what the mining companies are doing is they're saying, oh, we'll lump all of your family together. This is, I think, happening. I mean, the point you're making about urban areas in which there's densification. So I think one of the things to point out is that as much as there's urbanization, like my brother was going home this weekend, many of us travel back and forth, and we do go home. I'm going home tomorrow to go and be where my father is buried this weekend, and there is still that practice, right, that we're doing at home, where in some cases, like in Somkele, people are still burying people in their yards. There are places where we bury people in public cemeteries, like people do in urban areas. So the practices themselves are changing as people's lives change. And so that's part of what's happening, as I think you rightfully point out. And those practices are not the same as they were in many places. What we are doing in my family is not what my parents did just a few years ago. The practices themselves are on the move as our forms of life change. So I think that's what's happening, and what happens in every generation and will continue to happen.
I mean, I think it's clear that the problem we have is the MPRDA itself. It's instead of playing the role that it was heralded to play, which was to transform the extractivism embedded in mining practices inherited from Cecil John Rhodes, the most notorious of all colonists. It has entrenched dispossession. It's a tool to facilitate dispossession. Now, that's what needs to be confronted. Because for as long as you are having a peripheral conversation about the level of compensation of dispossession, your premise is to always accept dispossession as an inevitable fact of life under the MPRDA. But my own experience with my own clients is that they fundamentally reject mining, right? And even if you, my own father was a mine worker here in Johannesburg. He couldn't last for more than 3 years. He says this thing is intolerable. Being a gold miner, says it's intolerable. I can't live in a compound. I want to go back home and live with my wife. You know? Many people feel like that about mining because in its essence, it's a dehumanizing form of eking out a living. And communities who keep cattle, who keep goats, the first reason why the people of Marikana rejected the the Australian company, was that when they had gone there for testing, I think it's drilling, you were calling it drilling, testing, etc., they diverted the flow of water. And for the first time in like 100 years, the pattern of water changed. And this was truly shocking, because when they reopened that pattern, the water was poisonous. It had certain chemicals, right? And the cattle started dying or coughing, funny diseases, And so the community then associated mining with contaminated water. When they went to a meeting, it was a 98% no. Don't tell us about jobs. We don't want this thing. Don't tell us that we are poor. We've got alternative ways of surviving. We've been surviving without you. So for me, the question is, how do we help the communities to build robust systems of resistance? How does the law help them to oppose mining in principle, right? Now I remembered you, Dineo, because I think it was during COVID when we consulted you. Yes, now you see it. Yeah. She was our expert. Yeah, I now remember. So that is the big challenge. Is we've got a problem with the MPRDA, and the people who did challenge the constitutionality of the MPRDA were the property classes. It was Agri-SA. The MPRDA now needs to be challenged by communities for facilitating their dispossession. That's the first big challenge we have to think about as legal activists. The second thing, I think I agree fully with what Dineo has said about title. I mean, the whole thing came with Hernando de Soto, an economist from Peru, who said that if land is not in private title, it's dead capital. You could convert it and make it active capital if you give someone title. But the theory fell flat in Peru when they started converting informal settlements into formal title. But the theory also fell flat here in Joslovo when they started converting informal into formal. And they realized that it was a myth that banks would lend on the strength of land, that banks only lend on the strength of income. And in any event, if you are black, they won't give you even if you have income. Right? So the entire fundamental neoliberal theory about land as dead capital has been completely undermined by experience. The new thinking now, the new enlightened thinking right now, is thinking about tenure, right, as tenure, right, and different forms of tenure. Whether you are thinking about a system of nested rights in which several rights that compete but at the same time coexist, so that it's more inclusive rather than exclusive. By definition, under the 1931, I think, Deeds Registries Act, a title is at the pinnacle of the land tenure system. But the one element of a title is its exclusion. No one can come to your property if you own it, including your sister, your brother, your mother. And that is why when they tried to do this titling in Soweto, it was opposed by families. They said, but who are you going to give it to? Are you going to give it to my uncle? Why? Are you going to give it to my grandmother? Why? He said, leave it the way it is. Maybe family titles, etc. But it's deeply divisive and deeply controversial. And it has never actually solved the problem that it promises to solve. So there's more complication extending tenure beyond the township, beyond the urban area, into the rural area. So, I mean, Dineo's experience, I mean, many people who actually work in land know the problems, and they've all retreated from being champions of the title deed model. I am one of those. In my book, Land Matters, I rejected the idea. Finally, I want to thank Dineo. One of the things that struck me when I was reading is that, I buried my mother last year. When my father was buried, I was still a beginning. But there is something whenever I go to his grave, right? I go to visit him. That's how I told myself. I thought, Let me go and visit him, and I go there and talk to myself. I'm talking to him, you know. But I think that if someone came and opened that grave and removed him, I think I would be deeply traumatized. I honestly think I would be traumatized. I think I would fundamentally change as a human being. I wouldn't be here. I would probably go mad or something. So the reason I want to thank her is because what she has done is to take the, move from the abstract to the personal, and then to make the story like relatable, And so I started thinking, if this thing happened to me, I think I would really fundamentally be a different person. So it must be the same to victims of, particularly grave desecration. It's one thing to say I must leave my house. Okay, whatever, go to township if that's what I have to do. But I think it's another to say my father must also move, or my mother must also move. And so there's really power in this, in the sort of unspoken, because these people cannot speak. What they do, they live in the invisible world, and we connect to them only through the spirit. And so the disruption of the peace of that spirit, which is really what runs through this book, I think is a very, very powerful thing.
Why are you so popular? I'm only going to say thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Dineo, for a book that, to quote one of your interviewees, advances the history of our ancestors while also causing us to reimagine our relationship to land. And yeah, thank you all. And before we go, though.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to extend, my gratitude, because you could have been elsewhere, but you've agreed to actually be here with us. So I wanted to thank you for that. If you could just give a round of applause to them. But also just to thank all of you as well, because, you could have been in your homes, but you've chosen to come celebrate and think with us in this moment. I also want to really thank my colleagues at SWAP. Thinking about putting this together, particularly as we're mourning the loss of Prishani, has been quite difficult. But I think, the support that we have for each other really has been incredible. And I just want to say that I appreciate you, all of you. And I also wanted to really appreciate Simon Gash. He is sick to death. And he is a researcher at SWAP, a filmmaker, and an artist. And this is his photograph in the book. Yeah. And I wanted to thank him because, when you reach the end of the book, you're really exhausted to even think about the cover. But he nudged me gently to say, look, you have to consider what images of dispossession look like. And I remember also, arguing to say, I don't want a dilapidated structure of a home, because that's what dispossession looks like. But I'm extending the argument to say the desecration of ancestral graves is another form or layer of dispossession. And so he kindly said, let's drive to the Mpumalanga province, to one of the cemeteries where the graves are relocated to, and actually work with the images and see what comes out of that. So thank you so much, Simon, for this. Also, just to thank Kim and Lucinda for all their hard work that they've put through for us to be together. And I just wanted to read you something. Sorry, I know we have to, people are excited to have wine and food, but yes, that's true. But if Dr. Prishani Naidu, our director, was here, I would have thanked her personally, and I have in the acknowledgement sections. And I went through my WhatsApp messages to her yesterday, and I found a message that I thought I should share with you, because I would have really extended my gratitude to her. And I'm going to try to go through this without crambling. And I said to her, this was on the 15th of May, 2023. Hi, Prashani. I just wanted to send you a note of gratitude for the environment you continue to create at SWAP for us to grow. I'm mindful of how one's growth is a product of your nurturing leadership. I hope I can in turn pass your philosophy by growing others. Pardon me for sounding weird. I just don't believe in appreciating people only during their retirement. Have a good night. And the last message again was as Wits Press was going to print the book last year on the 8th of October 2024. And I said to her, the last proofread before printing. And I said, please see my acknowledgement of your impact. And I also acknowledge here, sorry. But yeah, I mean, I would have directly said this to her. She has created a space of intellectual freedom where we can think in different ways, experiment, and so on. And I'm truly grateful to her. But I would have also liked to thank Jacqueline Koch, who really protected my time as I was thinking through these ideas. She would often say when people asked us to get involved in the Just Energy program, to be involved in all kinds of things, and she would say, Dineo can't make it. She's busy. She's writing her book. And I felt that she was being overprotective at the time, but I'm truly thankful to her. And the last person I would have really given this copy to when it was released is Professor Phil Bonner, because he was one of the most outstanding oral historians in this country. And, I can't be thankful enough for him and to know as well for taking his legacy forward. So thank you to the History Workshop and SWAP really for helping me put this book together.